Good evening. I'll say that one more time. Good evening. I'll talk a little louder. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Well, hi, I'm Bart Roush. I'm one of the pastors here at Oak Grove Presbyterian Church. Very happy that you all are here with us this evening. We're excited about our presentation and conversation. I want to give a few items to help orient our evening and help you orient to the space for those of you who are new to our space. One of the most important things is bathrooms, which you can find. There are bathrooms if you go out any of the doors. There are several down the hall that way, or there is a single-use bathroom that way. If all of those are occupied, there are bathrooms downstairs. There's an elevator at that end of the hall. Let me talk about the structure of our evening a little bit. After I have a few words and after I introduce my co-moderator for the night, Elena Street-Stewart, she'll have a few words, and then our author, Chad Montrie, will give a brief presentation, and then we'll have a period of questions and answers. When you walked in, you should have received an index card. That'll be the way to ask a question. So just write, as you have questions that come to mind, write them on your index card, and then we'll collect them toward the end of Chad's talk, and we'll collate them. We'll try to answer as many as we can, and we may combine some so that we don't have repeats. And we'll do that for about a half an hour before we move over into the fellowship hall to continue conversation around small groups. There are some questions as prompts to use for small group conversation, but more importantly, when you get over there, you also can have cookies. And they come from an organization in South Minneapolis called Cookie Cart. And so I invite you to look them up. They're a great organization that helps young folks with some of their first jobs. We will be recording the event tonight. It's not live streamed, but we will be recording, and you'll be able to find it on Oak Grove's website and Facebook page later if you want to come back and take a look at that. If you have not yet gotten a copy of Chad's book, they are available outside in the hallway for a donation of $20. All the proceeds above the cost of the book itself will be donated to an organization which is escaping me now. Sorry about that. We've got it written out there, but it's a great cause. And then just to highlight two other events coming up this month. Tomorrow, Chad will be giving another talk at the Ramsey County Historical Society. It is both virtual and in person, and so you can catch that if it's at the East Side Freedom Library. So you can go in person there, or you can catch it virtually if you look up the website for Ramsey County Historical Society. The information is there. And then the city of Bloomington on August 22nd is hosting an event called An Indigenous History of Bloomington. The speakers for that evening are Dr. Kate Bean and Peter DiCarlo, and they'll discuss the history of Bloomington, how it can inform art and heal divisions and create a better future. Registrations are full at the moment, but there is a wait list, and there are a few first come, first serve, show up and grab a seat. There's some limited seating for walk-ins on a short basis. To center our time this evening as a starting point, I'm going to invite us all to say together Oak Grove's land acknowledgement, if you're able to see that. Join with me. We collectively acknowledge that Oak Grove Presbyterian Church is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. We reside on land that holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for the Dakota, Native nations, and Indigenous people in the region. The land was ceded by the Dakota to the U.S. government through treaties created and upheld with racist underpinnings. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to hold Oak Grove Presbyterian Church accountable to Indigenous people and nations. We recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. I invite you to just breathe for a moment. Now I'm pleased to introduce my co-moderator for tonight, Elena Street-Stewart, but first I want to tell you a little bit about Elena. There's a lot to tell. This is just a little. Elena is a descendant of the Delaware Nanticoke tribe and is the first Native American to serve as moderator of the PCUSA, as well as the first to serve as Synod Executive of the Presbyterian Church USA. Elena has been active as a church leader at the national level since 1980. She has chaired the Council on Church and Race and the Advocacy Committee on Racial and Ethnic Concerns. She's received the denomination's Women of Faith Award during the 219th General Assembly in 2010. She also serves currently on the Executive Committee of the Minnesota Council of Churches and is the current Vice President of the board. In 2001, Elena became the first Native American elected to serve on the board of an urban school district in Minnesota. Re-elected in 2005 and in 2009, she served as a chair of the board and as a district director on the Minnesota School Boards Association, the Council of the Great City Schools, and the National School Board Association's Council on Urban Boards of Education. Elena has led the Minnesota Minority Education Partnership, the American Indian Family Center, the National American India Alaska Native School Board Caucus, the St. Paul's Children's Collaborative, and the St. Paul Foundation's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. In 2020, Elena was elected alongside the Reverend Gregory Bentley as co-moderator of the 224th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church during the denomination's first ever online COVID assembly, which was a task all in itself. Please welcome Elena Street-Stewart to share a few more words about her work and to introduce our speaker for this evening.
First task always is to bring that down. Okay. Well, I'm glad to be here tonight. I am always feeling welcomed here in this congregation and in this space and meeting with you all. So tonight, I think we're all going to be learning together. And you know, what's important in life is to be lifelong learners. Sometimes we're the teachers, and sometimes we're the learners. And we can continue to rotate that experience. So tonight, I'll leave it up to you to decide what is the biggest priority about that kind of dynamic. It's important for us to take time to find out more about who we are and where we come from. I appreciate the land acknowledgement that you've offered. We need to do that everywhere and every day because you are always on Native land when you're walking around outside, inside, upstairs, and downstairs. It's important as I say that because most of my life as an American Indian is being told, well, we didn't know you were Indian. You can't be Indian. I'm from Philadelphia. I was often told, all the Indians are dead around here. You can't be Indian. And it's mostly because people don't see us. We are everywhere. And here in Minnesota with 11 tribes and many, many tribal members in our communities, small, large, on the reservations and off the reservations, I see Indians everywhere, but many people don't. But it's not that we're not here. It's just that we're invisible. And so, Chad, I thank you for taking that bold step to talk about whiteness being overwhelmingly visible in plain sight. But the irony of that is many white people don't see their whiteness. So that's what we're going to be thinking about tonight. And as I said, whether you're the teaching person or the learning person, this is your daily lesson right now, this evening. We do have a number of things in common. I didn't know Chad until I met him tonight. But one of the things we have in common is about truth-telling. and truth-telling in our historical records, as well as in the way we express those narratives in the news, in the media, in our professional work, and in our private lives. It's also very important to recognize that there is an increasingly creeping fear that some people have when they have to face the truthful historical corrections. And that, I think, is what you're going to help us do tonight, to be able to say, did you know this about that land right down the street from maybe where your house is, or where this church resides, or what you were taught in school about the history in this community and the organizations that emerged here? It's not that these things were hidden or were not true. They are the truth-telling, and they were visible in plain sight. But the reality is, some people chose to make them invisible and less valuable, so you couldn't learn from them or benefit from that information. Racial exclusion has no blank pages here on this continent. We have to recognize that our collective knowledge of our institutional knowledge and our national knowledge lives on in the way that we describe it and that we live it out. The legacy of whiteness is a collective memory. There is no one that has not been impacted by that, whether you're a person of color, an indigenous person, or a white person. And it doesn't just bear witness to a dead past, because it's an exploration of knowing how some people see the world and how the world sees them. So visibility is survival. Autonomy is survival. And I thank you for the historical records for doing that. And sovereignty and self-declared identity for people who are marginalized and excluded, that's all about our survival as well. So knowing this should ground us in our history, because the big challenge we face is the animate durability of white racism every day, all day, around us. And so we need to keep our minds open to learning more about who we are. And I appreciate the diligent work and the scholarly research that Chad provides for us tonight. He is a professor in the history department at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. He is the author of 5 books. I still don't know how people have the time to write books and concentrate on that, but congratulations for doing that. And one of them is the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is Whiteness in Plain View, a history of racial exclusion in this state, Minnesota. Chad's research interests have been centered in the American environmental movement and in racial exclusion in the United States. This past year, he was a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary, based in the History Department and affiliated with the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. Of his work and research, Chad has said, "I've always considered my work to be part of a larger project to help people understand the present by understanding the past." Now, those of you who know that I was co-moderator with Gregory Bentley, what was the image, the historical image from Africa that we used that described that? The Sankofa, okay? That's ancient wisdom, so deep, and you're borrowing from that. To be able to learn from the past, to take the learnings and the wisdom to carry us forward into the future. He wants to be able to find and tell compelling stories, which I'm sure he's going to find a lot out here in Minnesota, about individuals, organizations, and events, and sometimes maps and photographs complement that. You should know there's a major project that's gone on here, maybe you know about it, at the University of Minnesota, where they are mapping racism historically through documents and the land-grant colleges, that history. In talking about his focus on Minnesota in his research, Chad believes recovering that history reveals an important aspect of the politics, economy, and culture in Minnesota, as well as in the rest of the country. I don't argue that the state is unusual, and some people would probably argue back that it is, okay, or that the communities I profile in the various chapters are exceptional for their history of exclusion, but rather that they're representative of something fundamental about this United States as a whole. And so tonight, join me in my excitement in this conversation with Chad and with our history to see how it has informed our present and how a deeper understanding can lead to a better future. Please welcome Chad Montrie.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. And also, I want to thank especially, especially Kathy Howell, who got this going. The last time I was here in the Twin Cities, we met up and she came to another talk, and we have since been planning this, and she offered an invitation to come here, and then to Bart as well to welcome me to your church. And also to other members of the anti-racism advocacy team who are part of the planning and arrangements, and just generally the Oak Grove Presbyterian Church. I'm going to be as brief as I can this evening, like holding to half an hour if possible. And what that's going to mean is I'm also going to be very simple in sort of the things that I'm going to be able to say in terms of drawing from my book. And in a lot of ways, from what I've heard this afternoon, talking to different people too, this is history that is familiar to many of you, and so this may not be new. At least some of it will be familiar, and I think, though, that it's still going to be important to have it out, to have this like outline in our minds, the chronicle that I'll sort of present as a step to me offering up a few observations about some themes and topics that will lead us to some things that you might want to make some observations or comments or offer some questions. And then when you go to the next part of the program where you're at the tables and talking to one another. So if you'll just bear with me, I may be saying things that you can say you already know. I also, because we want to keep this short, I'm going to focus this really narrowly on the 19th century history of this particular area. So there's a lot more that I could talk about in terms of Minnesota's history of racial exclusion, but I'm going to focus this on what was going on in the early to mid, maybe late 19th century in the Oak Grove area, which becomes Bloomington, and I'm going to try to pay the attention to this idea that there are some important changes taking place in terms of evolving relationships between Native Americans and whites and African Americans, and it's a kind of entanglement that is sort of like defining for the 19th century, but one that really kind of doesn't continue into the 20th century. What you see, especially after the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 and then on into the 19th century's end, is a stricter drawing of color lines, right? And people sort of separating themselves out into groups, mostly because white people want it that way. And this is something that I talk about in the introduction of the book on page 6 and on over to page 7. I'll just read you a little bit of that section. Whiteness in plain view is not Native American history either. It's a part where I'm talking about what it is as a book. Yet it begins by explaining whites' removal of the Dakota and Ho-Chunk tribes from Minnesota during the 19th century. Most of the African Americans who initially came to the territory were enslaved, and they worked for whites as the latter extracted wealth through trade with different tribes, converted indigenous people to Christianity, and dispossessed Native Americans of their land. Consequently, the racial histories of each group were tightly linked. For a few decades, in fact, this was sometimes literal. Numerous territorial residents were bi- or triracial, as well as multilingual and multicultural, the sons and daughters and grandchildren of white, black, and Native parents and grandparents. The various forms of common interaction did not last, however, and the color line hardened as whites' land and bloodlust reached their conclusion in the U.S. Dakota War, which ended with the Dakotas' removal. At the very same moment, the United States was plunged into a civil war over racial slavery. Especially for readers unfamiliar with Minnesota history, chronicling the shift from racial entanglement to whites' first act of wholesale racial exclusion is critical for putting subsequent white efforts to hinder post-bellum black migration to the state in proper context. What's more, the need many whites felt to shore up white supremacy in the wake of the two concurrent wars, each of which was driven by conflict over that very thing, was a key dimension of Minnesota whites' racism against African Americans in the next century. So that was kind of my defense of why Chapter 1 is there, why I'd tell a story that's really as much about Native Americans as any other group. And I can tell you that some people resisted having that in the book. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of this with some slides and a few comments about the slides, and I'll move in, as I said, to the end to sort of trying to bring these together with a few observations of my own, and then we'll open it up to you. One of the people who's an exemplar of this entanglement is this gentleman here, Lawrence Tolliver, who was the local agent for the Office of Indian Affairs at the St. Peter's Indian Agency adjacent to Fort Snelling. He came at the very end of the teens of the 1800s, and he's there, sort of like representing the United States government with the idea that he's supposed to do something about Native Americans, although there's also, of course, the military present, and they have their own idea about what they're going to do with Native Americans and what everyone's supposed to be doing in terms of the way the U.S. government does or doesn't have a handle on the fur trade, right, and other skin trade. Lawrence Tolliver, though, in his personal life and in his work, really reveals how, for a while at least, whites, Native Americans, and people of African ancestry are sort of overlapping in their relationships. He, in 1827, decided to get married to a white person, and so he went back to Pennsylvania on a furlough, and while he was there, he found somebody to marry, and the father of that woman he was going to marry, who was an innkeeper in the town where Tolliver was, owned several people. He was an enslaver, and he decided that he would give Lawrence Tolliver one of those people as part of the dowry for him marrying the daughter, and that person was a 7-year-old Harriet Robinson, right? And so Harriet goes with Lawrence Tolliver back to Minnesota, and she, of course, eventually married Dred Scott, right? And they are together. Harriet and Dred Scott then are the people who are for a while at Fort Snelling in Minnesota in ostensibly free territory, then go to Missouri, and then Dred Scott files a lawsuit, becomes the Dred Scott case in 1857, which basically is the U.S. Supreme Court saying people of African ancestry have no rights that whites have to respect. Right? While Lawrence Tolliver was in Pennsylvania, of course, he has also another wife who is the Day Setts, and she is the niece of the Metawakanton chief Cloudman, and his Indian wife, the Day Setts, had a daughter, was pregnant, and she had the baby. While Tolliver was away, they named this young girl Mary, and Mary would grow up and was educated then later at the area missions, which we're going to talk about more this evening, right? So Tolliver there in many ways is showing you just how much there is that entanglement. Now, Tolliver also believed that Native Americans could be, in his mind, this is how he would put it, he would say they could be saved by being transformed, right? If you taught them the ways of white people, particularly how to farm, do settled farming, if they learned agriculture, and if they became Christians, then they could probably be kept in the place where they were. They didn't have to be displaced, removed. And so that's one of the things that he really gets into in the 1830s once he is settled. And these are excerpts from his journal. This is from a collection at the Minnesota Historical Society where he's talking a little bit about trying to set up these kinds of programs to teach Native Americans how to be farmers. Sunday, May 1st, 1831, and he's referring to Betty-Makaska by its name that the whites give it. I went to Lake Calhoun, Eatonville, the agricultural establishment formed for the Conatal. He's also writing that out differently. I found most of them at work cutting down trees, grabbing out the roots. What was more encouraging, some few of the men were at the unusual kind of labor for them. They laughed when they saw me. I praised them in every agreeable way that could be conveyed to them in their language, which was a challenge for him because he never learned any Native American languages, actually, as the Indian agent. He relied on others who were part of these mixed-race families who were usually culturally skilled, could be cultural translators as well as they were linguistically skilled and could translate for him when he was interacting. But he probably knew enough to talk to people like this. Sunday, July 31st, 1831, I rode out to Lake Calhoun on a visit to the agricultural establishment of the Indians. Some of their fields of corn fit for use, potatoes and general fields too promising, vines, squashes too, fish of all kinds in this lake. A large pike broke my line and carried it on my hook. So that's what Tolliver is up to at this point in the 1830s. And of course, the other side of this is missionizing or Christianizing the Native Americans. And the people that are most important to this, at least at this point, are the two brothers, the Pond brothers, Gideon and Samuel Pond, who arrived at Fort Snelling in 1834, and they were very quickly hired by Tolliver to be instructors at a village that Cloudman had at the shore of Biddamacoska. And then they did that for a while and then joined some other missionaries, Jedediah Stevens and John Williamson, at Lake Harriet. They went over to the other lake. And then in 1839, when Cloudman moved his band down to the Minnesota River, the Ponds followed him, and they built a new mission and a school at Oak Grove. And so then they're doing this for a while. Gideon remained. Samuel, of course, left in 1847 to start another mission and a school at Shakopee. And meanwhile, they're also learning. They are actually learning the Dakota language, and they actually create a written version of that, and then they start publishing things like this newspaper, which they call in English the Dakota Friend, with the idea that this would be an important part of their missionary work. But keep this in mind, because when we compare them and we compare Tolliver to other whites, there are some distinctions among how white people think about Native Americans and what that means for their interaction with them. As this is going on, of course, as you know, there are various treaties that Native Americans were basically coerced into signing that dispossessed them of the millions and millions of acres of land that they had. Initially, the land that they had to the east of the Mississippi River, and then by 1851, they're losing all of their territory west of the Mississippi River. And you can see inside that red outline, what they were sort of giving up by the middle of the 19th century with the last of the treaties, and the ones in 1851. When this happens, of course, the native people, Dakota, are moved to two reservations, and that opened up land to white settler colonists, and they started flooding in great numbers. And so then in 1855, Gideon founded the Oak Grove Presbyterian Church and really began to emphasize ministering to those white settler colonists rather than to native people. The treaties that the Dakota signed had promised them annuities. They were also expecting they would get some kind of food assistance because they were being, concentrated into these very small areas on reservations. They're being moved away from their traditional hunting and fishing areas, and so they needed, the federal government, the U.S. federal government, to follow through on what they agreed. But that wasn't necessarily happening very, very regularly, and eventually the tension got to the point where in August of 1862, we have the U.S.-Dakota War, and this then creates a sort of a turning point for many whites, many of the whites who were leading positions of power, to finally do a removal of Native Americans completely from what they called, or what they understood to be, the Minnesota Territory. And you hear people saying things, very clearly, very explicitly, what was on their mind. January of 1863, as the U.S.-Dakota War is happening, Governor Ramsey says, "The Sioux, or Dakota Indians of Minnesota, must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state." and other people say similar things. Even people that had once expressed something like sympathy for the Native Americans, how they're being treated by fur traders, by soldiers, by the U.S. government. And so Henry Sibley and others, sort of basically lead U.S. troops out to capture the Native Americans who were engaged in war. They capture them, and they put people on trial. And one of the people that is instrumental in terms of interrogating the people on trial is Joseph Godfrey, who I think is another example of the complexity of relationships in the 19th century, at least until this point in the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. Joseph Godfrey, who's in this drawing, was the son of an enslaved black mother, and also a white fur trader, right? And then he emancipated himself by running away from his enslaver. And in 1857, he moved to the Lower Sioux Reservation, where he married a Dakota woman, and they had children, right? So those children are triracial and trilingual. And Joseph Godfrey also can speak Dakota. And so the U.S. military officials who are running the trials, they make him the interpreter of all the people that they're putting on trial. And he even basically, he interprets for his father-in-law, who the U.S. government actually finds guilty and convicts and sentenced to death, right? So she's sort of playing even an important role in sending his father-in-law to death. There is a mass hanging that happens after the trial. There was going to be hundreds of people executed, but Abraham Lincoln, the president at the time, asked for the trial records, and he whittled that down to 39. There was another person who was not hanged, and there were 38 people then hung in the town center of Mankato. This is the largest mass execution in history, and it is basically the result of a war that's about race, right? And this is how white people are sort of ending the resistance of the Dakota. The other people that remained were removed to reservations outside of Minnesota, to Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, as well as the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. The Ho-Chunk are moved to Omaha Reservation in Nebraska. Godfrey actually was going to be hung, but he gets a reprieve. He goes to the Santee Reservation, where he remarries because his other wife decided she didn't want to have anything to do with him after he had his father killed, basically, and he stays on the Santee Reservation until 1909 when he died. There are many prominent white people who believe that this was exactly what they had hoped for. They celebrated what had taken place and how this led to the first full-scale racial exclusion in Minnesota Territory, and how that finally ended the presence, or at least they believed might end the presence of Native Americans in the area and allow for fuller occupation by the white settler colonists coming in. And they used what had taken place as part of their argument for the idea of white supremacy. And one of the people that did that really, I think, prominently is this person here, Daniel Buck. Daniel Buck arrived in Minnesota also in 1857. He became a state legislator and eventually became a state Supreme Court justice. So this is a person who has a lot of influence and power in the state. He is, in his time, respected, and even after that, into the 20th century, probably regarded by many people as being very important and worthy. But he is a white supremacist, and you can hear this in his things that he said from the bench. You can also hear it in things that he wrote, including a book that he published in 1904 called Indian Outbreaks. And this book began with this line: "The master race of the world is Caucasian, and its dominance is sustained by the devotion to both civilization and Christianity." But the other thing that he does in his book is to say that the Indian was wild and would forever remain so, and that the Indian was fully aware of the impending fate hanging over his nation and dooming it to eventual extermination. So if you're starting to put some of this together, you're realizing that Daniel Buck doesn't have exactly the same perspective as the Pond brothers or Tolliver. In the aftermath of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, the Oak Grove Presbyterian Church in 1864 is moved to the location where we are now. This is a picture from 1907. You can see Town Hall on the left, right, and the church on the right, and we were discussing how many buildings have been in this spot. This is the original. I guess maybe there's been maybe 2 or 3 or 4 possibly. There are still some Dakota around in this area, and maybe a dozen of them are actually members of the Oak Grove Presbyterian Church in the late 19th century. And there are services held, as well as Sunday school held, in the Dakota language by Gideon and others. And then when he retired in 1873, for the next 20 years, his son Edward and Edward's wife Mary continued to do that. They continued to hold services as well as Sunday school in Dakota. And eventually, at the very end of the 19th century, that group of Dakota decided to purchase land on the Minnesota River, upriver, and they moved away. And that's probably the last of the Dakota members of the church. Also, this is eventually by the 20th century, the area is starting to shift from a farming village to a suburban development. Houses are being built. And there are some people of African ancestry or African Americans around. In fact, some of them are charter members of the church, and they remain, as far as I can tell from census records, here in Bloomington until the 1920s. But then after that, there really aren't. This is really an all-white community. Maybe, like 2 or 3 African Americans might move in, move out over the course of the first half of the 20th century. By 1960, the population of Bloomington is 50,000 people. There are only a dozen black residents at that point, right? So a very, very small number. So all of this is sort of leading up to the point I want to make about, like, how do we make sense of the Pond brothers specifically, but maybe also Tolliver. By one telling, you could see those 3 men, and especially the Pound missionary work, and the aftermath of it, as simply one part of the cataclysmic forces that brought cultural upheaval and land dispossession, as well as exclusive whiteness to Bloomington. That they're just one part of that, and we don't make a distinction because, whether or not, they had a difference of opinion or different perspective, what they did effectively led to the end that where you have, a mass execution and removal. But it is important, I think, for us to acknowledge that unlike Daniel Buck, who believed that Native Americans couldn't be changed, the Tolliver, Lawrence Tolliver and the Pond brothers were acting with the assumption that Native American culture was malleable, and that what needed to happen is they had to become more like white people, right? They had to become farmers, and they had to become Christians. And that maybe raises a question for us about culpability. It maybe makes us wonder, do we put them in another spot in terms of talking about responsibility? And what does that mean for the church now? Because I know that's a thing that you're wanting to get into. That's part of what the anti-racism advocacy group is about. And this is something that I briefly address at the end of the chapter 1, on page 38. In 1935, on the 100th anniversary of the Pond brothers' arrival at Biddy-Makaska, members of the Pond Family Association met at Oak Grove in Bloomington on a farm owned by Gideon's son, Hein. There they took the opportunity to consider the meaning and legacy of missionary efforts among the Dakota people, and in doing that, to resurrect a mythology that separated the religious work from the cruelty it helped to facilitate. In a program titled The Secret of Race Relations, participants acknowledged that there was little to show for all the missionary labors by the time of the U.S. Dakota War, but apologetically pointed to the, quote, courageous acts of the few Christian-inclined Dakota to save white captives during the fighting, as well as the mass conversion among Mankato prisoners shortly after. Demonstrating what was and would remain a familiar practice of misremembering history to dodge culpability and escape responsibility for past and present racism, the gathered whites rewrote what had happened. And this is a quote. "The way of greed and prejudice in this case led to wholesale massacre and destruction," the program explained, while the way of service and friendship led to the healing of wounds and the opening of a new chapter of hope. So I deal a lot in Whiteness in Plain View with details. I've actually heard some criticism of the book that along these lines saying there's just too much, it's overwhelming. But what I was feeling compelled to do, partly it's just because I can't stop, putting all that in, is to establish a wealth of evidence, because I knew I had to make a strong case, right? That it had to be able to stand up to criticism or even denial, right? There's still going to be many people that are not going to want to hear this, they're not going to want to know this, because it has implications. If you do acknowledge it, if you do begin to accept it, then what do you do next, right? And I also want to make clear with the detail that there are actually people involved. There's real individuals behind this. This is not fiction. I'm not creating or crafting a narrative, and I want people to be identified. But I also want to make sure that those individuals don't get lumped into a simplified version of the past, but rather that we pay attention to the way in which each of them are individuals in history, individuals in time, and that they live, just like you and I, very complex lives. On the other hand, I think we need to acknowledge how everyone then, as well as now, are part of a particular moment in time, and that their thinking and actions are shaped by historical forces. And often, those forces are beyond our own full understanding and control. And so looking back at them, it should make us hesitate in terms of how we think about who they are and what they did, what they thought, what they did, without bringing so much of the present into our sort of evaluation or assessment of their lives. My training and my purpose as an historian is not to make a moral indictment, but rather to interpret the past, including braiding episodes in time into a larger narrative, to see it as a whole. And I see this book, Whiteness in Plain View, as revealing an under-acknowledged history of white racism, which is very critical to understanding the present. If we don't know that past, then we really can't understand where we are right now. And if we do begin to better understand the present through that better history, I think we'll have something in our hands to also make a different kind of future. If we want to make change, if we want to aim toward a different future, then we have to start with thinking about what happened in the 19th century, what happened in the 20th century, and connecting that to where we are right now in the 21st century. So I'm going to wrap up there. Hopefully I didn't go too far over time, and I think now we're going to try to have a group sort of response to any questions you might have or any comments that you would want to make. But thank you for your attention and for coming this evening.
If you have questions that you've written on a card, we've got folks that you can hand them to start with. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Elena. We've got a couple of the kickoff as you're thinking about some questions. Yes. Chad, what are some questions you wish people would ask you about this book?
About the book.
About the book, or more generally, the history of this place.
I had really a lot to go on. What do I think I wish people would? I don't know. That's like a hard question.
Sure.
I guess people usually ask me really good questions. I never really think like, oh, I wish they would ask me something else. But
fair enough. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say maybe one of the...
Yeah, they'll grab it. And
Could one of the questions be, so what really continues to bring black people here to Minnesota? Years ago, there was a play in Iowa called They Kept Coming, and it was about African Americans arriving in Iowa on the various rivers, and then how they would settle. And then they would settle around those rivers. And the play was wonderful because it said, in spite of like all these things that people were sharing in the play, they kept coming. So what is it that meant for black people, even today, to still arrive here? We have one of the largest African immigrant populations in the country here in the state of Minnesota. So yeah, what are all those things that bring people here?
Well, I think there's a lot of push that happens. So in the next chapter, chapter 2, after this one where I talk about what's going on in the 19th century, well, actually, I think, yes, I pick it back up to talk about Thomas Montgomery. So I open chapter 2 with Thomas Montgomery, who is involved in the group of soldiers that are going after Native Americans, going after Dakota, and then he gets pulled off of that and is sent down to the American South to be part of the Civil War. And he is a racist person, but he is put in charge of what they call a colored regiment. And he, over the course of time, by sort of leading this U.S. regiment, begins, I think, to get a little bit more perspective and gain a certain racial consciousness. And he has this idea that maybe he could help some of the soldiers in his under his authority to go north after the war. And so he starts talking to his dad by writing letters, saying, like, would you look into to how we could get some land that would allow us to do a colonization, what they call a colonization project. But what he finds is that his black soldiers don't want to leave because for a very brief period of time, it looks like the United States government, with a Union victory, which is then also sort of associated with the radical Republican policy, that they're going to rebuild the South along lines of equality, and that black people will actually have a lot of opportunities. Not only will there be an end to slavery, but there will be full civil and political equality, and they'll have a lot of opportunities to stay in a place that they had actually begun to call, like, this is where they live, this is their home, right? And they don't want to leave, right? And then, of course, there's the end of Reconstruction, and that doesn't play out, and that's when you really start to see so many African Americans moving out of the American South to places like Minnesota, also Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, because they're escaping something terrible, right? They're escaping the denial of the rights that they are supposed to be guaranteed, like including the right to vote for black men. They're escaping white terrorist violence. They're escaping cultural racism that is unleashed once again once white elite plantation owners are put back in power. And they think that there's more opportunity and something at least attractive about the North, something different. They don't expect everything's going to be perfect, and that is in fact not, that's not what they encounter. And they don't, once they do realize that there's still discrimination in employment, housing, there's still, cultural racism, that doesn't make them leave Minnesota. They just try to do what they can with the new context where they find themselves. It's still better, they think, in many ways than the South that they had fled, right? Yeah.
Will you talk about a little bit, as a white person, why this research, why writing on this topic, what led you as a white person to do the work you're doing?
Okay, I like that. That's a good question. Well, this may actually bother some people for me to say this, but I actually don't believe in this essentialist idea that people can only write the history that somehow is their identity. So, like, that you have to be a woman to do women's history, or that you have to be black to do African American history, and we could get into finer grades, right, of some identities, and that eventually we just have one person writing the history of the identity that they are, right? Because I think that people, I guess I'm still sort of old-fashioned in holding on to these, I know, some tainted Enlightenment ideas, that if I look at evidence, that I can create an argument, and then you can argue back against that using other evidence, and we can have a conversation, and I have to make, some kind of claim, that I have some kind of handle on the truth, and that you can sort of dispute that. But you have to also have something, that you can marshal to say, this is why I think you're wrong. On the other hand, I do think of this book as not being black history. It's not African American history. It's not Native American history. People that are black, people that are Native American are featured in the book, but they're not the main historical actors. What I'm trying to do is recover a history of white racism. And so as a white person, part of why I wrote this book is because I think it's part of my responsibility, being who I am in my time and place, and sort of how I, sort of had the privilege that allowed me to live the life I did, going to college, going to get a PhD, getting a good job at a university, that I need to do something with that, right? And I think in the very, I think, right sort of, people were very, very interested by the 1960s and 70s in going out and recovering, like, say, the history of African Americans and including, telling the story of civil rights activism that's going on in the 19th century on into the 20th century, right? That we actually kind of missed telling the story of white racism, that there's a lot still to tell about what white people did to explain the white racism that black people and other people are trying to challenge or resist and change and overcome. And I sort of see whiteness in plain view as part of that. And I see this as really kind of very an underdeveloped area of the discipline for me as like an academic historian, and I think there's going to be plenty more. And so like I have another idea for a next book that will focus on Minnesota, that will look at another feature of racism here in the state, and try to explore something that I don't get into as deeply in the book. I just keep finding more and more things I want to kind of recover in terms of that history of white racism.
I know you said that your job is not to make a moral judgment. Mine is. Right. And it is the.
So what's your call then? On
right.
But you've heard the evidence.
You know that we talk about an anti-racism to be response able, to understand what our privilege is, to understand the current systems that are in place based off of past things, and then by that fuller understanding, then to do the work. On that note, just a couple of questions from the folks out there. You spoke about the intentional misremembering of history in the 1935 service of Oak Grove. The early 20th century was marked by much of that, also in reference to the Civil War, as a way of white people allying to and making peace with each other. Can you talk about what lessons we might glean from them for facing and negotiating our own current tensions without making of the same long-term damaging concessions, also known as intentional mistelling of the truth?
Well, okay, so, if you want to jump in on these questions. I mean, if you're the person who wrote that's asking for an example, when I first started doing book talks, when the book came out in April of 2022, one of the places that I went to was Hastings, which is briefly profiled in the book, and I'm actually now good friends with James Curry, who is a descendant of the Curry family. It was one of the black families that settled in Hastings at the end of the 19th century. They bought a church in Hastings, which was burned down probably by white people as part of trying to drive the African Americans out of the area. James, along with the archivists at the Historical Society, many other people, began putting together a program that's all about remembering and reconciliation as a step toward doing something next, right? And they don't necessarily know what that next thing will be. I think they have some ideas, but meanwhile, they think it's, at least useful for their community to begin to bring themselves together as a collective, to hear what stories could be told, to explore the archives and other sources for more of the story that maybe they don't know, and then to try to communicate it to each other and to others in the community and outside of the community. And so James, for instance, is a documentary filmmaker, and he's making a film about the Curry family and their movement from the rural American South to Hastings and then into Minneapolis. This is like citizen history making, right? And Jim Loewen, who is one of the inspirations for me in doing this book, was very into that and is always trying to inspire people to do the work of historians themselves. You can do this. One of the reasons why I'm an historian is because it's pretty easy. Like, I can't do math. There's a lot of other things I'm really bad at. And it's like, I'm really in awe of my friends who are physicists and stuff like that, engineers. I think I do history better than a lot of people because I'm trained how to do it, but it is a thing that people can do, with a little bit of instruction, with a little bit of help, and you can do kind of like a remembering and reconciliation project of your own wherever you are, whether it's Oak Grove, Bloomington, Edina, Richfield. There's a lot more of this story to tell, and I am not the kind of person who, I sort of have some kind of proprietary claim over the work I've done. At this point, this book is yours, and all of the things that I can offer you in terms of advice, I'm happy to give you. I'm happy to help you with whatever kind of that, sort of grassroots history doing that you want to sort of begin. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so one of the lessons, though, to be conscious of is that it's also not for white people to continue to acquire knowledge and then express that, like, now we know all these things, and you still don't do anything about it to make sure it never happens again. So I think the reality is, even as historians, is to be able to say, when we tell the story, what does we mean? You know, the Tonto and Lone Ranger story, like, what do you mean we, white man? You know, who's the we when you talk about Oak Grove?
Right.
You should never mention Oak Grove without your land acknowledgement and saying, remember, this actually was a village area for Dakota people or other Native people because it's so near the river. So don't just accumulate the knowledge, because that's also what white people tend to do. They appropriate all the resources, hold them for their benefit. With that knowledge, what are you going to do to benefit the people who have been denied the opportunity to experience those benefits? So that's a challenge.
You will have some opportunity to reflect on that very thing later, just a heads up. Can you comment on relations between Black and Indigenous folks? Is there a strong negative relationship today? How and when did it change after the end of the 19th century that you talked about earlier?
Well, again, is this on?
Here.
Maybe the battery. Yeah. This cord, we might have to change places.
Yeah. We're flexible.
You know, I didn't know really anything about Minnesota history before starting this, and I didn't know about the history of the U.S. Dakota War, and so I came to it kind of fresh. And one of the things that I encountered, and maybe people know this and they just deciding not to talk about it because it's kind of inconvenient, but there are a lot of tensions between the Dakota, besides the kind of entanglement that I was talking about, there are also tensions between the Dakota and people of African ancestry. And with the U.S. Dakota War, some of the Native people, Dakota, are killing people who are Black, right? They're killing also abolitionists who are like, at least talking about race in a different way, and they're killing African Americans who maybe don't even really have like anything to do with the kind of like the kind of treatment that the Dakota are reacting to. So, for instance, there's this guy who's a barber, and he's there at I think the Lower Sioux Reservation, and when the war breaks out, the Native Americans there just kill him, right? And I mean, how do we explain that? What does that mean? Does that matter? Do you just sort of absolve people of that as, that's somehow justified as part of war? It's not really kind of warfare in the way that many people would talk about warfare, right? On the other hand, who gets to decide what warfare is? So, I don't know. Like, I actually was kind of troubled by how the U.S. Dakota War kind of didn't fit in terms of like a script about a war, including also then like the Dakota War, people killing children, in families, just going onto a farm and killing everybody there, including the children who are present. You can look and point back to why people might be motivated to feeling the way they do, so that they would engage in that kind of violence. But that also many African Americans are caught up in that too. And I think the color line, when it gets drawn more strictly after the war, there are still a lot of interracial relationships, but most of the ones I'm finding are whites and Blacks. I still find that kind of interesting. It's something that I can't really explain with all of the sort of the resurgence of a sort of a white supremacy, with the way that white supremacy sort of permeates Minnesota culture and politics and history. There are still many cases in like communities where there's a Black man married to a white woman, or a white woman in some cases married to a Black man, and they're having children, and no one is, as far as I can tell, driving them out, right? Because they're staying there, for 10 or 20 years, and maybe even their children stay there after them, right? So I don't know, still a little unsure about people's relationship with one another in terms of across race lines. But I do think that generally you can say there's a stricter color line in Minnesota by the late 19th century.
Yeah, I'll take a different viewpoint on all that.
Yeah.
There have always been strong relationships, both good and bad, between persons coming from Africa and indigenous people here, because remember, originally those people coming from Africa were also indigenous people. But let's just look at today. So within 3 days after George Floyd was murdered, I was wearing a t-shirt that was translated in Ojibwe and Dakota that said Black Lives Matter. So let me just tell you, Native people are on this stuff right away. The incident that just happened down in Alabama about the fight at the war front, I saw a posting last night of a white folding chair with a headdress on it. So Native people are always about alliances. We want to be able to identify who we align with. But the reality of race dimensions back at these times was much different. You can't just say all people of color were somehow of a common mindset, because that didn't exist yet. There weren't even, there wasn't even a monolith of Native people. We were 500 and some different nations. We were saving our land. So anybody that represented the invasion of that needed to go. So I'm telling you, as a Native woman who's now an elder and can think about our histories, but the relationships between people across race lines, we need to open that up. It is not just what white people see and define as race, because so many people from Central and South America are mixed with our Native population here. And if you recognize that people in Central and South America, up to 60% sometimes in those villages, are of African descent. So the mixture of the world is much bigger than how white people define it. And we see that, we live within it, but once again, it's not visible because white people don't know how to recognize that identity. There we go.
I've got maybe a few simple, quick answers here. During the time that slavery was legal in Minnesota Territory, post-Dred Scott, did slave auctions occur in Minnesota?
It was never legal in Minnesota. So, but people had enslaved. The officers who came to Fort Snelling had they were given money to purchase. To basically have enslaved labor, coerced labor. And so initially, soldiers who were going to Fort Snelling just bring people who were enslaved with them that they already had owned, had purchased, and sort of had as slave labor before they came. And then they started actually going down to the slave market in St. Louis and buying people and then bringing them back to Fort Snelling. But there's dispute about whether this can be allowed, and that is what gives Dred and Harriet Scott the foundation or ability to bring a case to the U.S. Supreme Court, because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 said there couldn't be slavery in these territories. The Compromise of 1820 said there couldn't be slavery above the Missouri line, and they had been in ostensibly free territory, so now they're brought to Missouri, which is a slave state, but they said, well, we've been in free territory, so we are now free, right? And the court rules against them. Before they did that, though, a woman named Rachel won a suit in which she made the same argument, and she won, and she was freed. And that's actually part of why Joseph Godfrey's mother was actually freed by her enslaver, because he was afraid. He was thinking, well, she's gonna claim that she's free anyway, and so he let her go. And then she went off and married this white German American soldier who then died in the Mexican American War, I think. But so there's Lawrence Tolliver, when he talked, he owned I think almost 24 people in his lifetime. He rarely ever referred to them as slaves, but rather as servants, right? Because he knew that he wasn't supposed to be doing this either, that they know that they're not supposed to be talking about this as if it's the same thing as the slave institution they know in the South, right?
Whether slaves were able to be purchased or transported here, slave money did come to Minnesota, so don't forget that. It wasn't even just about the bodies. A lot of the land that was then either conceded or stolen from Dakota people then was exchanged with your banking institutions that had slavery dollars in their coffers. So again, the money came here just as freely as anything else.
Follow the money. Speaking of money, when was the gold payment for 1862 actually made? Was it a full payment, an amount? And was the next payment on time?
The gold payment?
The gold payment.
So the war happened. I don't know that there ever was a payment, because then when the Dakota were excluded, they would not have had a right in court, I don't think, to settle anything that was due them. Today, going back through those treaties might give you some sense that it was the land exchange, meaning the acreage within a reservation that was set aside. But the closest you get to maybe like a gold payment is out in South Dakota, out near Pine Ridge, you know, in the Sacred Hills. But I don't know here. Unless, if somebody knows something, let us know.
Are you talking about the annuities that they're supposed to be getting, that, or some one last payment or something called a gold payment?
With the war.
Check was in the mail.
Well, that sounds a little suspicious to me, but yeah. We were going to pay you until you started the war, right?
What a coincidence.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, this is just like 1862 is 1 year of, like, there's many times when the annuities aren't, yeah, so. Yeah.
I'm going to take this as our last question so that we can then move into some small group conversation and have cookies. Did Dr. John Williamson's witnessing of the trials of the Dakota prisoners help shape Lincoln's decision to commute many of those sentences? Oh, sorry, John P. Williams, sorry.
Well, within the Dakota community that are Presbyterians, there's a lot of affection for the Williamsons. And how much that may have influenced Lincoln, probably Bishop Whipple probably had more influence around some of those, you know, conversations with the president. But we still need to understand what Lincoln's role was as an emancipator. You know, if he was able to still address the issue of the hanging of the Dakota men and then turn around within weeks to announce emancipation, but that did not really change anything for people immediately. What were the political gains and what were the challenges that he faced in, you know, bargaining after the war? And so I think that the Williamsons probably, in all good faith, really saw Dakota people as the people they were sent to care for in their call. How much they were able to handle the political negotiations around that, I'm not sure really what their influence was. And that, again, is just because I'm looking at Dakota Presbytery people, that's where they lived, and that's the Williamsons lived with them for a long time, just like the Ponds lived. And Dakota Presbytery was formed in 1844, so before, 2 decades before the uprising, there were Dakota Presbyterians who were calling and ordaining their own native pastors. So, I mean, we have a whole church history in addition to what is being shared here today, which most Dakota people would relate to more. And in fact, this weekend is mission meeting, if anybody knows Dakota's history. So this is the big mission meeting happening out in Flandreau this weekend. That's where you'll hear these stories about the missionaries and what people, you know, felt benefited them. But I'll just say, I haven't heard much where they would say, and if it hadn't been for Williamson talking to Lincoln, you know, this is what would have happened to us. They do recognize Whipple, and even then, Whipple, you know, didn't free everybody. But Williamson was more seen in terms of the calling and the caring for people because he lived with them so much.
You'll find across the hall on individual tables are platters of cookies as well as some prompt questions for you. I want to have us say one more thanks to Chad Montrie and to Elena Street-Stewart and to all of you. And just one more reminder, there are books for sale, and I bet Chad would sign it for you. Go ahead and